All right, I'm going to read through now the first couple of chapters of my book, Hypermodernity and the End of the World, co-authored by Brian Francis Culkin and with a preface written by Michael Aaron Kamens. The book has become exceedingly rare since the three of us could not come to an agreement on it, and I ended up taking it down, and I have no access to the files for putting it back up. So a few hundred people probably bought copies. I forget how many it was, maybe 300 or 400. So it is very rare, and I have been getting a lot of requests from professors and students working on the concept of hypermodernity. So the word is out, and it's spreading and getting around. So this is one of the foundational texts of hypermodernity, perhaps the first one written for a general audience anyway, rather than for a specialized, narrow academic topic of hypermodernity. So the term pre-existed me. I didn't invent it, but when I went a few years back and looked online to find a coherent articulation of it, there wasn't anything. There was nothing. So then I wrote my blog essay that was published on culturaldiscourse.com, and I wrote that on there. It was a big hit, and I've included that essay in here, and I'm going to read it today during this particular session. Okay, so here's the book with my signature on it. So let's read the preface, first by an extraordinary preface, actually, by the very talented literary artist and poet Michael Aaron Kamens. So let's see here. It was the year when they finally immanentized the eschaton. The Book of Revelation got nothing on this new apocalypse by Culkin and Ebert. They are no doubt the real hype of cultural criticism today. So was John of Patmos. One is the father of a new Americana of visionary criticism, and from a modest casita in Santa Fe must be sitting on the most valuable literary estate of a generation. Boy, do I wish that were true. I mentioned this last point because with nearly 30 books and 500 plus, actually now it's 900 plus, YouTube videos, from film reviews and philosophy to poetry and commentary on the decay rate of virtually all cultural phenomena, John David Ebert is still practically unknown, beyond a small but international cult following, and a tight circle of writers, artists, and meme madmen, aka the hypermoderns. Ebert can't even get his Wikipedia page restored. Has he not accomplished and suffered enough? That remains true to this day. Let's change that with this book. And Brian Francis Culkin is one of the rising stars of American critical theory. In the tradition of great expat writers, this once star athlete, basketball, from Boston, Massachusetts, escaped the U.S. drag for the jungles of Peru. Like a virtual Colonel Kurtz, Culkin lives among the Iwascaros in the Amazon and writes his reflections on the heart of darkness of global capital. I suspect, like many of the best minds of our generation, Culkin turned on the DMT circuit in his brain, dropped out and tuned in, logged in to John David Ebert and the mesmeric nascency of this meme we call hypermodernity. And like surrealism or beatitude, this old term, which we probably saw once in some book by Paul Virilio, has been given new meaning and power. The upstart Culkin, alongside Ebert's magisterial life's work of several decades now, has already made some laudable contributions. His books on the semiotics of boxing, Boston gentrification, the heroin epidemic, and the 45th U.S. president, amongst others, should give Ebert some hope that his unique brand of American visionary criticism will endure, and assure the reader that you couldn't ask for better guides to the landscape that has rapidly blown up around us since 1995, or the end of the world. Regarding this late modern condition of the hyper, or hypermodernity, I consider Jean Baudrillard's theory of integral reality especially apt. So much so, in fact, we could just as well be talking about integral modernity if that modifier wasn't so fraught with annoying associations. By integral reality, Baudrillard meant something like the real and the imaginary collapse together from the disappearance of their metaphysical barrier, e.g., the reality principle, after the advent of nihilism, to their absolute recurrence as hyperfolded virtual reality. I suspect that before metaphysics, Western philosophy understood as Platonism, set all the binary distinctions that would characterize modernity, e.g., being, becoming, sensible, intelligible, subject, object, our predecessors dwelled in a magical, mythical, pre-metaphysical hybrid reality, to adapt a word from Bruno Latour. From Plato to Descartes, this hybrid reality was divvied up with hard lines, keeping the real and the imaginary apart. The latter, as theology, ensured the value of the former, and their sustained separation allowed the existence of a positive factual order, freed from contamination by subjective factors and spectral spectral phenomena. But between the scientific revolution and Nietzsche's word, God is dead, the sky, or supersensible realm of metaphysical ideals values, lost its supporting pillar and fell into the earth. The imaginary collapsed into the real. And now, like the stellar sparks of the Gnostics, the imaginary recurs in the scintilla of electronification, in the proliferation of screens and images. The broken shards of the intelligible are incarnated into the smartification of objects. In 1993, the UK novelist Jeff Noon published his popular Alice in Wonderland-inspired sci-fi novel Vert. The protagonists, the stash writers, get high on pharmacologically engineered feathers and online. These feathers must be an allusion to the 1990 creation of Nintendo's Super Mario Bros., where besides his usual magical shroomery that would enlarge him and grant extra lives, Mario gets to consume a special feather and leaf that transforms him into a shaman-like raccoon hybrid who can fly. Noon's Vert is often compared to William Gibson's Neuromancer of the decade before, but where they differ is illustrative of the special nuance our authors call hypermodernity, a subtle distinction between the cyber and the hyper. The virtual reality of Gibson's cyberspace was still one step removed from reality, accessible only through technical means and never more than the epiphenomenon of a techno-medial substratum. You can still always unplug. But the Vert, like Carl Jung's collective unconscious or objective psyche, is a hyperspace. It's always there, an invisible ocean bubbling up in dreams and imagination. And the different colored Vert feathers are a miracle of both pharmacology and new media. So going online in Noon's dystopian Manchester is not like accessing a digital archive stored on mainframe hardware somewhere, but more akin to astral traveling or a shared DMT trip. The Vert can't be turned off, and addiction to its feathers makes the Vert bleed through everywhere, swallowing up people and things here, now there, swapping them out for its own oniric beings. Like the saying of Orpheus, the gates of Pluto must not be unlocked, for within is a people of dreams. Indeed, in Noon's 1995 sequel, Pollen, it is revealed that the Vert, like a silent alien invasion, has been gradually colonizing reality. Citizens are disappeared, and gods, fairies, and other archetypes walk right out of fable and myth and into the streets of our lives. It is significant, then, that Ebert and Culkin tagged the year 1995 when the internet went public with the advent of hypermodernity, and since then, it's like everything has been flushed down the rabbit hole and folded inextricably into the Vert. There is perhaps no better example of hypermodernity, of a phenomenon that evidences Baudrillard's concept of integral reality, than the strange case of two books that have been brought to wide attention since Donald Trump became the 45th U.S. president. These are Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey and The Last President, both by author and occultist Ingersoll Lockwood. Briefly, the titular Baron Trump is a child of a wealthy aristocratic family residing in Castle Trump. He finds a book from the 15th century by a man named Don, who claims there is a world within the world, i.e. the hollow earth. The only point of entry, however, is a portal in Russia that Baron Trump sets off to discover with his dog Bulger. They do indeed find the portal and travel to several strange wonderlands throughout the hollow interior globe. One land they visit is a land of transparent folk. The inhabitants are in a constant light that shines through them like amber, requiring constant eyewear, like a steampunk-styled Google Glass. This place, according to Lockwood, is called Goggle Land. Wow, it really is amazing how works of art and literature can be decades ahead of coming developments, just as I wrote about the artist Mark Rothko in my book Art After Metaphysics, with his luminous squares of light in the 1950s was obviously prescient of the world we inhabit now. We're surrounded everywhere now by self-luminous squares of light. In Lockwood's other book, The Last President, a mogul who lives on Fifth Avenue, New York, wins the presidency as a populist. But riots then break out immediately on all sides, and he brings about the end of the Republic. These books seem like obvious Swiftian satire with allusions to frequent items now in the MSM since Donald Trump became U.S. president, but the first book on Baron Trump was published in 1893, and The Last President, subtitled 1900, was published shortly thereafter, 1896. In the hypermodern chatter concerning these books, you can hear every kind of theory, no matter how translogical, that President Donald Trump is Ingersoll Lockwood, the latter having long extended his life through the occult arts, or that President Trump's grandfather secretly acquired a time machine built by Nikola Tesla, or some weird combination of theories including the so-called Mandela effect in action. The imaginary no longer held in the sheltering sky, or in check by the reality principle. is now the semiotic excess, the hyper, and social reality augmented with it becomes hyperbolical, overdetermined, globally synchronized and supersaturated with virtual beings. Even old quantum spooks loosed from the atomic age when we split holes in our ontology, or absences. And that, by the way, is the title of one of Michael Aaron Kamens' first work of poetry, Absences. It's absolutely superb, which was partially inspired by my book, Art After Metaphysics, which discusses the term I invented called semiotic vacancies. As we progress further into the post-truth hypermodernity, we should expect more high weirdness like Trump and Ingersoll Lockwood. In hypermodernity, synchronicity replaces cause and effect. If hypermodernity is an integral reality with no more distinctions between the real and imaginary, then why hasn't the world fallen back to the pre-modern hybrid reality, or just disappeared into a plane of consistency, as into the Gnostic pleroma, or returned to the pre-cosmogonic chaos prior to the separation of the world parents, Mother Earth, Father Sky, real, imaginary? Is it because hypermodernity implies technical mediation which maintains modular market-drawn distinctions between things? In other words, capital speculation draws and redraws the lines between things, delineating them into planes of organization, and according to the dictates of the global economy. As our authors discuss the modularity of hypermodernism, its IKEA-like topography of de-worlded entities, what they've called digital capitalism, seems to work like Empedocles' strife and love. It makes everything one. Love, the same class of harmonious thing, a modulable, monetizable, denuded mass via digitalization so it can flow smoothly with light speed circulating through the hollow earth. And yet the ever-shifting cutting edge of demand and innovation keeps things jostling, maintaining planes of organization, shifting things through new iterations, ever-new modulations of beings in the digital clearing of the Vert. Everything is captured up into technical modules of capital kept in global circulation like an electromagnetic hurricane. And that's why everything hasn't already disappeared, to paraphrase the title of one of Baudrillard's books. But what I've only broached here in highly speculative form is the enterprise and question of this book by Culkin and Ebert. Yes, why not? Or how precisely the end of the world? This semiotic excess, the hyper, is really the fate of the Newman today. There is a history of the hyper. It was the magic potency of things for our foraging ancestors. It was the intelligences, genius loci, and value of things conveyed in the myths of the planting peoples and religions of the high civilizations. And later it became the being of philosophy and the question of meaning. It flowed through meridians and geomantic ley lines. It shone as the halo of saints. In antiquity it spoke to poets, oracles, and prophets. It was the thunderbolt of Heraclitus, the more perfect logos of Philo of Judea. In the medieval era it was locked up in the heavens and was the ether that turned the spheres. In the modern era it was brought down from above but was dislocated into the future to be reached by the venture capital of progress. Today, after the future, the hyper is the nowhere. It's the bleed-through effect of what I call C cubed GI, or CGI cubed, the capital climatic global imaginary, aka the hypercloud. The Earth has been encased in a digital etheric sphere of electromagnetic signals that forms both a matrix for the radical actualization of the imagination and a kind of neurognostic prison for the psyche. C-cube GI, a Vert integratron of the Internet of Things that folds the reels together. Your private unspoken thoughts show up moments later and before as recommendations from Amazon, Google, etc. Ads infinitum. You look absolutely beautiful. You truly belong here with us among the clouds. That's a quote from Empire Strikes Back, Lando Calrissian talking to Princess Leia. In the retro future, welcome to Lanulos. Ride a connecticomb laser in the archives, the 30 ethers. And of course, Kamens' second great book, it's even greater than Absences, is Clouds, which he finished about 2 years ago. I highly recommend both of those books. They are masterpieces of hypermodern poetry. The beats mapped at 100 miles per hour the post-World War II American infrastructure of interstate highways in the twilight of the old railroad Earth, while military electronics were rapidly disseminated into both a new media and pharmacological horizon, the Twilight Zone tunnels of 60s TV and LSD. That new mediality mutated rapidly and exponentially so that in the 70s, many intelligent people could not imagine more than a quarter century left of history, till the coming of one or another apocalypse, e.g. Y2K, the AI singularity, or the end of the Mayan calendar in December 2012. It is perhaps significant, then, that some of the first specific texts on hypermodernity appeared in 2013, with John David Ebert's aptly titled Art After Metaphysics, followed by my own poetry cycle, Absences, and a steady succession of books by Brian Francis Culkin, and the writings and artworks of others, such as the art of Chris Boyd, and recently the meme trickery of Ikayu Sojin. According to this register, hypermodernity is simply a literary movement branded by a small but international circle of writers and artists addressing the transformations of our being in the world since the internet went public in 1995. And that is no minor task, for those transformations were anything but minor. They were instantiations of an alchemic paradox, the simultaneous dissolution and apotheosis of the modern horizon. Between Hiroshima and 9/11, that horizon was vaporized and, like digital sublimate, resynthesized in the clouds. But these transformations, or hypermodernity, are only the latest iterations, if not also finale and absolutization of an old story of progressive eschatology. From Joachim Fiore's Age of the Holy Spirit and Gerhard Doren's Unus Mundus to AOL and Microsoft Azure, we're all floating now in the sky-blue coelom of the Faustian alchemic imagination in the clouds. And the hypermoderns are really all of you reading this book, a book which will finally give some directions, if not yet to any destinations, then at least to the landmarks and signposts of a way. For all of us hypers are mapping at light speed the information superhighways of an entire Gnostic electronic globe, through the hollow earth and into the twilight of places, including the stubborn mentality of the Gutenberg galaxy that imploded into cyberspace by 1995, and since the cloud, iCloud 2011, has been unfurling into the dream space of the hyper. You can follow Culkin and Ebert further down the rabbit hole towards the end of the world, into the ecstasy of evaporation if you dare, but in many ways you already have. Now it's time to wise up about it, learn where you are. Just how far out are you in the new eon since the curtains closed on the moderns, since the appearance of the Tic-Tac UFO and the Clockwork Elves? Sail along with little Baron Trump in his boat of a gigantic tortoise shell. Take the Pegasus Bridge. Carry the barrel, unless you want to remain in the water asleep with the fishes. Mac, March 23rd, 2019, Los Angeles, California. That's probably one of the best prefaces ever written. It's like a miniature book unto itself. Absolutely fantastic. And you should check out those two books by Michael Aaron Kamen's Absences and Clouds. And part of the reason why the disagreement over this book was the fact that I wanted to include Michael's writing in the book in more places than just the preface, and Culkin didn't want it because Michael's writing is too sophisticated for him to understand. Culkin is a literalist and a shallow materialist, however good he is with economics. But all right, so now I'll read my essay, Introduction on Hypermodernity. Let's see, it's out of focus there. Happened by focus. There we go. This was the essay that I wrote initially on my blog, culturaldiscourse.com, and I think it was 2018 when I was looking around for a definition of hypermodernity, so I decided to define it with this essay, which has been slightly rewritten and includes a contribution by Culkin. So, every world age comes into being out of a catastrophe. The great geological epochs, i.e. the Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, and so forth, all came into being out of the liquefaction and melting down of the biogeological forms of a previous world age. The same can be said of human cultural epochs as well. Hence, World War II is the great event that separated modernity from postmodernity, irrevocably dividing one world age from the next. Everything that we think of as postmodern came into being after it, i.e. eclecticism in architecture, the death of the meta-narrative, Lyotard, the rise of minority cultures, decolonialization, and the voice of the cultural other being expressed in academe, Spivak, etc., etc. Likewise, the event that separates modernity properly speaking, demarcating it, say, from the Enlightenment, from all that went before it, was the French Revolution and the succeeding Napoleonic Wars, that eventually, once the dust had settled, led to the Haussmannization of Paris, a complete structural reworking of boulevards, streets, and demolition of old, worn-out neighborhoods that was already consistent with the revolutionary tendency toward deconstruction, that is to say, of the getting rid of old grand historical meta-narratives, hence the advent of the metric system, the attempt to implement a new world calendar by getting rid of months and days named after old European gods and goddesses intertwined with Christian eschatologies. The difference in world horizons is exemplified by comparing Ingres' 1827 painting the apotheosis of Homer with Manet's 1862 Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, whereas the former painting apotheosizes the West's grand Homeric narrative of descent from the classical world. Manet's painting absolutely defies all attempts at trying to find a narrative in it. After the restructurings of Haussmann and Napoleon III, the French Impressionist painters put Paris on the map as the capital, not only of the 19th century, to quote Walter Benjamin, but of the entire project of modernity down to World War II, after which the center of the art world shifts with abstract expressionism to New York, although Paris becomes the intellectual capital of postmodernity in the 1960s. Such eventual shifts between world ages can be found all throughout history, for they are not at all unique to Western modernity or even geology. The 17th century BC, for instance, was an age of horizontal demarcation with the advent of the two-wheeled horse chariot and compound bow that, in the West, created the Mycenaeans of the Peloponnese, Troy level 6, 1700 BC to 1200 BC, and the Hyksos invasion of Egypt, which was ruled for a little over a century by Semitic peoples from Palestine. The Hyksos dynasty ended the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, and then their expulsion from Egypt by the twin brothers Ahmose and Kamose around 1530 BC marked the transition of Egypt into its new kingdom imperial phase and the creation of its trans-Palestinian empire. Another such event takes place around the year 1200 BC, which brings this late Bronze Age of the chariot empires to a close with a massive systems collapse signaled by the Trojan War, end of Troy 6, circa 1250 BC, and the eruption from the Black Sea of marauding sea peoples who systematically dismantle and destroy the Mycenaean world. The Hittite Empire, and nearly all of the cities of Palestine. Egypt barely survives this period intact, but its imperial days from that point on were over. Not to digress too far, but I think it is important to understand that such world ages are nothing new, and indeed make up the ontology of both biogeological as well as human cultural history, which is catastrophic and discontinuous, as Cuvier had always insisted. 2. The great event, likewise, that signifies the decisive shift from postmodernity to hypermodernity was September 11, 2001. Up until then, as Baudrillard liked to point out, events had been on strike and had apparently ceased to happen, as globalization dissolved history into its anticlimactic end. But 9/11 was the great Hyksos event that signified the transition of American political power from the concerns of what Carl Schmitt called its Grossraum, that is to say, its transnational hemispheric domain, to the building of an imperial security state apparatus, with a global external proletariat defining a specific outside in the form of those neo-Hyksos barbarians known as the Mujahideen and their various genealogical offshoots, ISIS, etc. At least this is the event that signaled the shift on the political plane, for on the technological plane the shift can be more precisely demarcated to the year 1995 when the National Science Foundation turned the internet over to the public. The impact of the internet on all previous forms of media is the equivalent on the technological plane of the Hyksos event of 9/11 on the political plane. For the internet now proceeded to provide hypermodernity with its world interior, which had earlier been architecturally expressed in the 1851 event of the Crystal Palace and the Great Exhibition in London of that year, preceded by the Parisian prologue of the arcades of the 1830s, which provided modernity with its world interior, namely that of a global shopping mall. This was a kind of translucifying of retail space, an opening up of it, as it were, by liquidating its walls and rendering them transparent to the outside. As Walter Benjamin pointed out, the department store came into being out of the Parisian arcades, as well as the concept of retail stores connected by labyrinthine alleyways with iron and glass enclosures, whereas the Crystal Palace simply enclosed all retail space into a single gigantic linear open mall lined with purveyors and merchants, the ultimate outcome of that phase of modernity marked by the discovery and conquest of the New World and the expansion of Western imperialism across the planet, from whence signifiers of all kinds and sorts were ripped from their various cultural contexts and put into the circulation of industrial capitalism. Whereas the world interior retail space of postmodernity was the advent in Edina, Minnesota in 1956 of the shopping mall, which introduced the innovation of turning all the retail spaces away from the city center and faced them, as it were, with their backs, while enclosing itself in a bi-level air-conditioned interior as a miniature city. The shopping mall, with its fake plants, strategically placed fountains, and above all, its electrified staircases in the form of escalators, became the world interior of postmodernity. And along with it, the non-place, that is to say, the eruption during the 50s in America of the interstate highway system and its various motels, fast food restaurants, and strip malls, all of which had a decentralizing effect on the quaint old city center of the traditional modern city. While the downtown areas began to crumble, the city exported itself to the countryside, so that as McLuhan, the great prophet of postmodern media, put it, every truck stop cafe with a television and a newspaper became as cosmopolitan as New York or Paris. But then hypermodernity put an end to the shopping mall, which began to dissolve and disappear during the decade of the 2000s, as the internet in turn decentralized the mall by exporting it to the living room. In effect, the mall became an individualized rather than a communal experience. With the internet, the individual never had to leave his or her home to shop, and so during the 2000s, retail stores, shopping malls, and their connected media, bookstores, record stores, magazines, and newspapers, began to disappear as they were absorbed into this new, totally electronic world interior. 3. Whereas the media of postmodernity had all been analog, records, cassette tapes, photographs, magazines, celluloid, the media of hypermodernity is exclusively digital. With the satellization of the exosphere, the analog telephone became transformed into the cell phone, and later the smartphone, which jacked the individual into the world interior from wherever on the planet he or she happened to be located. One didn't have to go anywhere to be included in the new hypermodern world interior. All analog photographs could be dissolved from their nitrate surfaces and melted into cyberspace directly from the brain, as the camera became an appendage of the new world interior. Vinyl records were dissolved and liquefied, and celluloid films transformed into bytes that obsolesced the movie projector. All analog media were liquefied, dissolved, and fed into the new matrix. Now the individual was empowered to become a new kind of entity, for hypermodernism has created the hyper-individual, a new and bizarre kind of individual that is nothing like the traditional Western idea of the transcendent self. For this new self is floating, discarnate, deworlded, and decontextualized from all world horizons. The hyper-individual has no connection with history, community, or any kind of idealistic utopian projects. Those all characterized the past. The hyper-individual is a world unto himself. Hypermodernity pours liquid scorn upon all utopian projects, since such projects presuppose a historical narrative behind them. The hypermodern individual has no connection with the past or the future, indeed does not even have any connection with the preceding moment, for he/she exists in a timeless, spaceless, ahistorical, and modular present. The structure of time in hypermodernity is modular. It is composed of a succession of present moments, each of which is isolated and has no relationship to any preceding moment or any future moment. The ontology of the individual is that of an amoral hedonist achieving sensory gratification in each present moment, which is disconnected from all others. As a result, there are no values and there are no visions, and above all, no connection of the individual to any traditional social formations. He/she has become a nomad, on his/her own, disconnected, modular, and historyless, hence the advent of the dangerous loner, a new anthropological type of hypermodernity which we will discuss later. Whereas the transcendental self of Western history was an objective entity who was actually embedded in a historical flow that connected him ultimately all the way back to the Greeks, the hypermodern individual has no connections to anything but the luminous glow of cyberspace. Now that he/she has become disconnected from all utopian projects and all sense of community, for there are no longer any world spaces for him to gather within as part of one or another social grouping, he/she can, within the world interior, gigantify him or herself to the level of an icon by using the new media that enable this process to take place. As I pointed out in my 2011 book, The New Media Invasion, Jeff Bezos is Amazon, Mark Zuckerberg is Facebook, Larry Page and Sergey Brin are Google. On Facebook, the hypermodern individual becomes a unique presence in cyberspace with his own website and his own YouTube videos. The technology now enables him or her to gigantify out of all proportion to any relation of scale that would connect him or her to any group or social formation whatsoever. Thus, the sobering truth now begins to dawn. Communism is dead. Critical theory is dead. The public intellectual is dead. For all these phenomena presuppose connections of the individual to larger social formations beyond himself as a modular unit isolated to sensual gratification in the present moment. The internet, with its satellized connections to the exosphere, unplugs and deworlds the individual, putting him into orbit about the planet. Hence, revolutionary protest groups, such as the Weathermen Underground of the 70s, or the Baader-Meinhof terrorist group in the German Democratic Republic of the 70s, now give way to the phenomenon of the lonely, isolated spree killer, who stands for nothing and represents no one. The spree killer, disconnected from all social formations whatsoever, wishes to leave a mark on the socius because he feels somehow disincluded from the larger project of modernity. The irony is, however, that in actuality there is nothing that he is disincluded from, since hypermodernity has melted down all coherent social formations. The modular individual as world island unto himself is the only ontological self that exists in hypermodernity. 4. Under the conditions of hypermodernity, there is no longer any art world per se, no longer any New York or Paris that functions as a cosmopolitan world center for the artist to be a part of. Art now simply exists wherever there happens to be an artist, scattered at random across the striated landscapes of the global planetary surface, New York, Santa Fe, Flagstaff, Los Angeles, or he is a criminal who, like Banksy, must get into the city, make his mark, just like a spree killer, and get out quickly. Anselm Kiefer, with his isolated junk shop world horizon at La Rabaud, typifies this new ontological status of the artist as a loner who creates his art out of junked signifiers taken higgledy-piggledy from the blown-out civilizations of the past. Is there any longer even such a thing as the practice of art as an activity distinct from, say, science? The Plasticine anatomical corpses of Gunther Hagens would seem to defy any clear separation of art from science. In these new vague ontologies, an artist like Anselm Kiefer begins to take on the ontological status of a junkyard dealer. Under the conditions of hypermodernity, there are no more art movements, only individual artists dotting the ontological clearing opened up by this new and uncertain global world interior. Hypermodernity is the death of art, but not perhaps of the artist, who manages to eke out a living like a retrieval of some Robinson Crusoe figure washed ashore with a junk heap of broken signifiers from dead worlds surrounding him. J.G. Ballard's 1974 novel Concrete Island is a foreshadowing of the ontological status of the artist in hypermodernity. And now section 5 here was written by Brian Culkin as a contribution to this version of the essay, but his section here was not included in the original blog version of this. On the economic plane, hypermodernity is based upon the globalization of neoliberal capitalism becoming fused with the power and logic of computational technologies. Wall Street and Silicon Valley merge into a singular global power of abstraction, quantification, and subjugation. In a certain respect, one could almost make the incredible claim that all hypermodernity really is an entire world defined by the operation of globalized capitalism as such, the full return of capitalism's primitive energy, freed from all of the constraints and measures put in place throughout modernity as it presents itself as the singular path for the destiny of the human race. But this logic of a pure neoliberal-styled capitalism that has been installed on a planetary scale is not simply applied to traditional spaces of economic productivity, such as the factory, perhaps the archetypal symbol of the industrial period of capitalism's development, but to virtually all of our public, political, cultural, and communicative territories, even our very biologies. In the era of hypermodernity, human life itself is recast as a business. Our very breath becomes a site of potential capitalist expansion and reproduction. What we encounter within this paradigm is both the idea and the social application that all of human life, whether it be interpersonal relationships, Facebook, Tinder, etc., human health, the mass privatization and corporatization across the field of public health, artistic expression, streaming music sites, the rise of the social media celebrity, politics, data as a political tool, the voter being ideologically recast as a consumer, etc., can be subject to the law of both capitalism and the new law of data extraction and aggregation. That is in many ways the simplicity of hypermodernity's economic logic. Capitalism is life. Life is capitalism. A more nuanced analysis would assert that the economic horizon of hypermodernity is a bizarre combination of cybernetic game theory, a radicalized free market economics developed at the University of Chicago in the 70s by the likes of Gary Becker and Milton Friedman, the neoliberal political logic initiated by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the 80s, and then perhaps the most important feature of hypermodern economics, the various computational technologies and processes that have been continually developed in Silicon Valley since the 80s that effectively allow the basic drive of capital to flow through the entirety of society on an interconnected global network. From the application of this logic, the entire global economy is sent into orbit around abstract techno-financial forces and thus becomes deworlded. All local economies, such as the farmer in a rural Mexican village or the factory worker in Ohio, are simply wiped out and made progressively irrelevant by the abstraction and automation that now runs planetary capitalism in the 21st century. These last three paragraphs here are mine. But it is not just local economics, local economies which are weakened here. The power and integrity of the nation state itself begins to decompose. The basic operation of transnational capitalism and hypermodernity demands that the regulatory and legalistic framework of the state becomes neutralized, and made progressively impotent in constraining the endless circulation of both capital and data across borders. The result is often the empowerment of local criminal organizations which rush in to fill the gap left behind by the state, such as the cartels in Mexico, groups like ISIS in the Middle East, and the various groups in Central Africa that control the incredibly lucrative mining operations. Thus, the economic transformation creates, as a side effect, its own internal proletariats and what the German theoretician Heiner Mühlmann calls disruptive cultures as a result. Empowering the global economy means a disempowering of local community structures, generating violent counterreactions in turn. 6. Finally, in hypermodernity, there is no longer anything to achieve. Utopianism is dead. Revolutionary movements, despite the Arab Spring, are gone. Idealism is non-existent under such conditions, since hypermodernity locks the individual into a modular present that is disconnected from all preceding presents. There is only the now. Anything that has occurred more than 48 hours ago simply ceases to exist. Where are we at here? Civilization has now become the sum total of its population, a planet of individuals achieving instant gratification, amoral, valueless, unmotivated, and without vision. All exoskeletal spheres, to use Peter Sloterdijk's term, are gone. And now there is only social foam, that is to say, individuals rubbing up against other individuals, each with their own private semiotic sign regime clashing with each other's. Whereas in modernity, civilizations with their own sign regimes clashed with one another. In postmodernity, terrorist groups as social formations clashed. But in hypermodernity, each individual is a nation-state unto himself, armed and equipped with his own electronic sign regime to do battle with other suits of light in cyberspace. With the annihilation of all geographic distance due to globalizing technologies, there is now nowhere for the individual to go to. The world interior of the civilization now exists on a glowing, self-luminous surface in front of him. There is furthermore nothing to achieve, since all utopian projects have come to an end with the liquidation of all social formations. In hypermodernity, too much is never enough, for it is a society of excess, surfeit, and signifier overload. Anyone can become famous for any reason, but under the conditions of constant electronic liquefaction, that fame will last precisely 48 hours. In a society in which everyone can become famous, no one in particular is famous. Thus, the structuring anthropological types of the previous world order of postmodernity are melted down under the impact of the unfolding architecture of planetary cyberspace. Hollywood stars, musical icons, and public intellectuals cannot exist under such conditions because the digital technologies of hypermodernity enable anyone to enter the civilizational clearing without the slightest effort. Hence, there is no discipline that is necessary to master because all such conditions have been liquefied and melted down to be thrown onto the junk heap, along with all other civilizational paradigms. But there is an empire to build, and you must be careful in this new world interior what you do and say, for you, as a perpetual and continuous inhabitant of its inside, are constantly under surveillance. There is no place where you are not. The Forum and the Agora are everywhere. You do not need to go to them. They are already wherever you are. You are civilization now. Okay, we'll stop there with this reading, and then next we'll pick up with the dialogues that Culkin and I have throughout the rest of the book. One little sort of footnote, I submitted this manuscript to Semiotext. I was working for Semiotext as a proofreader for a while there, for about 10 years actually, and I submitted this to them, and it's owned by Sylvain Lotringier, who's famed in the academic world for importing French postmodern thought with his small press and these small books by Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault and Baudrillard and so forth into the world of American academe in the 1980s. So he's a bit of a celebrity. And he glanced at it. He probably didn't read it. He just glanced at it and gave it a dismissive wave of the hand saying, this isn't real theory. It's just, it's playing with theory. In other words, it's not French theory. He's clinging to a dead world. Postmodern critical theory is dead, done, and gone. It's over. He's a dinosaur. Semiotext is clinging to a dead world. It hasn't published a good book in many, many years. And so this is American theory, and this is one of the foundational texts of hypermodernity. So We'll leave it there for this video, and then we'll continue next with probably 4 or 5 more videos to get through the entire book.